Hello? Great, we have sound. Wonderful. We're going to get started if everyone would like to take their seats. So, welcome to this official side event on operationalizing finance for loss and damage, examples from Africa and the Caribbean. My name is Emily Wilkinson. I'm a senior research fellow at ODI, a global affairs think tank, and also advisor to the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica. I want to just to set up the discussions today and the event in the context of COP27 and what's happening in the negotiations, and acknowledge that we may have hopefully had an auspicious start to the negotiations on loss and damage with the inclusion of loss and damage finance as an agenda item in the finance track. So whilst this is really the start of a process, it's a good context in which to be having these discussions and to be holding this session today. And I think as researchers and practitioners that you're going to hear more from in a moment, we do need to be ahead of the negotiations. We need to be ready with ideas of how to operationalize loss and damage finance if, hopefully when, there is an agreement on establishing a financing mechanism. So we're going to hear more about some of those ideas shortly. We have an excellent panel, and you'll hear about different analyses, examples, principles, and recommendations for loss and damage finance. But first, I'm very pleased to welcome Ambassador Francine Barron, CEO of the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica, CREED, to give a keynote. Francine has been a lawyer for 25 years and served as Attorney General of Dominica. She has extensive experience in the diplomatic field, having served as High Commissioner to the UK and Ambassador to the WTO and to the UN in Geneva. She has also served as Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs and was in that role at the time when Hurricane Maria hit Dominica, so in 2017. Francine, we're very pleased to welcome you to this event today. I'll hand over to you to tell us more about what loss and damage means for Dominica and what you think, what different sorts of kind of finance do or financial response we need to deal with these kinds of extreme weather events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, and good afternoon to everyone. I think, for those of you who do not know, Dominica is a small island in the Caribbean that sits somewhat within the hurricane belt. And with climate change, we have experienced more severe extreme weather events. We would have had, between 2015 and 2017, two extreme events that resulted in a combination of 90% loss of GDP and 226% loss of GDP. So within a period of 2 years, we would have suffered in excess of 300% loss of GDP. I'm sure that you have heard similar stories or perhaps had similar experiences. But for us in Dominica, when Hurricane Maria hit, it was a Category 5 hurricane and had sustained wind speeds of 220 miles per hour and higher gusts. That hurricane impacted the entire island, and around 80% of the population were directly impacted. 65 people died, and more than 90% of homes were damaged and in some cases were destroyed. 90% of crops and livestock were lost. So the impact on Dominica was extreme. The island was without electricity and water immediately after the storm, and in some parts of the island, it took over a year before electricity was restored. A total of about US $1.3 billion worth of damage was done by Hurricane Maria alone. And after the impact of Maria, seeing the massive devastation that the island suffered, the Prime Minister made the pledge at the United Nations, the 72nd UNGA, and he gave the commitment that Dominica would become the first climate resilient nation in the world. And so Dominica has been on that journey since 2017, looking at how we can transform Dominica so that it becomes more resilient. We know that we will most likely suffer the impacts of extreme weather events in the future. We have seen since the 2017 storms in the Caribbean that many substantial storms have impacted other Caribbean islands, causing severe damage to them as well. We had just 2 years after Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, which literally sat on one of the islands in the Bahamas for more than 1 day. And so what can we do differently to ensure that we weatherproof our countries? We in the Caribbean, we would have the challenge of being highly indebted, and a lot of that debt being as a result of having to continuously respond to extreme weather events. And so just that sole challenge results in a difficulty in being able to access financing because of the high debt status. And so when one looks at the efforts that one has to make in order to mitigate one's loss, to adapt to the effects of climate change and the significant financing that is necessary to make that happen, then one really has to consider what are the options that are available. After Hurricane Maria, CARICOM would have had a financing session in New York where pledges were made by international agencies, by philanthropists, from a number of different commitments were made to provide support to the Caribbean to recover from Hurricanes Irma and Maria. The challenge that one has is that, notwithstanding the fact that after the event, pledges are made by countries, by organizations, being able to, in fact, realize those pledges is where the challenge really is, because it is not a question that these pledges are made and those monies are immediately available. In many instances, what you receive is just a small fraction of what is in fact pledged. So in Dominica's case, we would have had pledges amounting to almost $100 million, but the reality is that not much more than about 20% of that would have been realized. And so how does a small country with limited resources recover and build back, and even build back better? This is where the idea of there being loss and damage funding available to small states, to vulnerable states, becomes very important. Our small states in the Caribbean are not major polluters. However, we disproportionately feel the impact of climate change. We must mobilize the resources to be able to weatherproof our countries, to be able to better withstand the impact of climate change. And therefore, it is incumbent, and I am pleased that there is going to be discussion on this topic at this COP, and hopefully there is something meaningful that can be agreed upon, because when one looks at a situation, for example, like Dominica, where 226% of GDP was affected, and this is really just looking at the actual damage. There are a number of other areas that would have been impacted that is not captured in that 226%. And therefore, the limitations that we have as small states being able to access the necessary financing makes it difficult for us to be able to recover. We would have taken the decision in Dominica to form a specialized agency tasked with leading our efforts at building and becoming a resilient nation. That was the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica, which I now head. And that agency was tasked to look at developing the roadmap, if you would say that, for becoming a climate resilient country. And in developing our National Resilience Development Strategy and our Climate Resilience Recovery Plan, what was clear is that we needed to look at resilience in a holistic manner. We needed to look at resilience not only of our physical infrastructure, but the resilience of our communities, the resilience of our economy, the resilience of our environment, the resilience of our social structures. So we're looking at resilience in a holistic way. Now, there are aspects of resilience building that lends itself, for example, to private finance, because building a resilient economy and diversifying our economy provides avenues for there to be bankable projects that private investors may wish to invest in. But there are aspects of building resilience that are not open to projects that are bankable or of interest to investors, because governments have to provide support to vulnerable communities. As I said earlier, we would have had communities that would have suffered significant damage, and government would have had to step in to provide housing, to provide materials to allow people to recover. Now, this requires significant funding, but this is funding that one has to find sources of finance to meet. What is available? Is there financing that is available that is either grant funding or is concessional finance? And there lies the problem. Most of the funding that's available it's loan funding. So in many instances, governments who are already suffering from a high debt burden would have to go and borrow even more to be able to provide the support that they need to provide to their constituents. And so we have to find a solution that makes sense for vulnerable states like the Caribbean. And I think there are a number of different avenues that one can look at. We have the climate finance, which is made available, but in most instances, that climate finance is in fact available as loans. And in many instances, it is so very difficult for one to be able to successfully go through the process to be able to draw down on that climate finance. So you'll find yourself in a situation sometimes when you apply for the financing and it takes 4 or 5 years before you can even begin to have $1 to spend. By the time that happens, the situation on the ground has changed. You may have been hit by another hurricane, and the scope of the problem has become much worse. So there has to be, when we consider the question of loss and damage, when we have discussions here, we have to look at a mechanism which allows vulnerable countries like our countries in the Caribbean, and I'm sure the same applies to other countries in Africa, in the Pacific, to be able to access financing that is affordable, but that is accessible in a very short space of time, because time, unfortunately, is not on our side. We're talking here at COP about 1.5 degrees to stay alive for the Caribbean, but every indication is that that target is not even going to be met. And long before we get to the point of 2 degrees, we're going to be in a situation where we may no longer be able to live in our countries because everything has gotten so bad. And we talk about hurricanes as being maybe one of the most devastating things, but you have droughts, we have diseases that are brought about as a result of these conditions. We have invasive species, we have the warming of our seas causing coral bleaching. So there are a number of different impacts that we suffer as a result of the warming climate. So I spoke about the idea of climate finance and the need for us to be able to attract financing that is affordable and is accessible. There are other instruments that are available. Within the Caribbean, we have CRIF insurance that governments can purchase to be able to have a quick payout in the event of an extreme event. But of course, the premiums for that insurance are very high. So I don't think any government is going to be able to insure at the rate or at the level that it would need to insure to be able to have the funds to respond very quickly after an extreme weather event. So that is also one of the issues that is relevant, I think, to us having this discussion within COP, that the countries who have contributed most to this situation must have the obligation to provide financing to help us to be able to minimize the damage from climate impacts, and also to be able to recover and to build better, so that for the future, if we're impacted, we do not suffer the same level of damage. And when we talk about loss and damage, we also have to ensure that whatever system we put in place, when funding is made available, it's not too complicated. Because, you know, we sometimes laughingly say that you almost need to have a PhD to be able to fill out all of the information and to provide all of the documentation that is required by these financing institutions for you to be even able to get to the point where you can begin to draw down the funds. So when you're dealing with small countries, especially countries that are stressed by having to respond very frequently to these disasters, we have to be looking at a mechanism that is not complicated. Yes, you have to have in place good governance and proper checks and balances, but it's very necessary for the process for accessing the funds to be simplified as much as it's possible to be simplified. And so I'm hoping that in the discussions that will take place at COP in relation to what mechanism can be put in place for loss and damage, that those are some of the issues that will be considered. Yes? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We may have time for one short question if someone has a question for Ambassador Barron. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Maybe I just ask, oh, sorry, there is a question from the audience. I think we're just getting a microphone.
Can the person who had raised their hand, who had their hand raised?
Hello, my name is Akshat. I'm from India. I write for Down to Earth magazine in India. I wanted to know how estimations of loss and damage are being done in the Dominican Republic, because there are impacts not only from hurricanes, as you mentioned, but also from so-onset events like sea level rise would also be an impact. So how are estimations of loss and damage done? Because you said that whatever estimations from the hurricane were there, they were limited. So are there any processes that are being put into place for these estimations to be done properly?
Right. Thank you very much for your question. And you're right. In relation to situations where infrastructure is impacted, it's much easier to calculate loss and damage. One of the things that we're working on is the development of the resilience cost gap analysis, which is really looking at what is it that is required over and beyond what you would normally have spent to make things more resilient, to put resilience measures in place. So we're actually doing some work now in terms of developing what that resilience cost gap measure can look like. So we can say whether it is to ensure that your institutions are resilient, then this is the additional cost that it's going to take to make your institutions more resilient, to make your communities more resilient. This is the extra cost. So the work is actually ongoing at this point in time, and we hoped to have been able to share that at this COP, but we have not completed the exercise. We're still doing some of the data gathering to be able to work out what that resilience cost gap would look like.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. And I think, it's definitely worth having a conversation with organizations that do like post-disaster needs assessments and those kinds of methodologies to see what they're including and what they're leaving out as a starting point for really understanding loss and damage. But there's lots going on. Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Barron. We're going to I'm going to hand over now to Inez from the Stockholm Environment Institute, who's going to facilitate two panel discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, Ambassador Barron, for joining our event and for your very clear speech on what is needed and what the demands are from Dominica and from Caribbean islands. Yes, so I'm Inez Bektawi. I'm a research associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I am here to moderate this panel in which we are welcoming more people who are here to talk about the situation within countries, but also within their communities, on how they address loss and damage, on how they access or do not access funding for that, and what they think can be done at the local, subnational, national, and global level here at this COP. So first, yes. Sorry? Thank you so much for coming. First, let me introduce you our panel. So first we have Dr. Augustine Jevanic. Dr. Augustine is a lawyer with 26 years of experience in environmental policy and governance advocacy in Cameroon and the Central African sub-region. Augustine serves as the chair of political and technical affairs of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, who is one of the co-organizers of this event. He is the coordinator of the African Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access, and he's also executive secretary at Bioresources Development and Conservation in Cameroon. Dr. Augustine, thank you so much for being here with us. My question to you is, given that the whole continent of Africa is one of the most exposed and most vulnerable to climate change, yet they are the least responsible. We know that the accumulated emissions of Africa are around 3%. Yet Africa is such a large continent with so many diverse geographies, with so many diverse climate, social, and cultural and economic activities. Given your overview and experience interacting with and advising populations and governments of these countries, could you tell us about your work and what the similarities and differences are in how African countries are affected by and handle losses and damages?
Thank you, Inez, and thank you for having us here. From the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, we are really honored to be part, to co-organize this very important session with you guys, and we think the time has come when we will not be talking about numbers again. We'll just be talking about the hypocrisy that characterizes the international community and the so-called multilateral negotiations. talking about the continent of Africa, the recognition of the special, the particularity of the African continent is not just today. It was recognized right in 1992 under Article 41E of the Convention, which says particularly in Africa that is prone to droughts and floods. So when you look at this, it means special attention had to be taken on Africa because it was already recognized as such in the convention. Africa, at the moment, as we speak, Africa, being a large continent, is drowning and burning at the same time. The whole west coast of Africa, and even in the Central African region, many countries are suffering from floods. In the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, the droughts that have been existing are exacerbating every blessed day. So, for a continent who is struggling, that is struggling with its infrastructure, when climate related disasters come into play, it compounds the whole issue. Currently, the African infrastructure needs, or the African infrastructure deficit, is calculated at $2.3 trillion. Now, if you add the fact that they have to climate-proof infrastructure that is even inexistent, it's taking us to $3 trillion for a continent that has contributed little or nothing to the current climate crisis. What do we see in the international debate? You know, the other day people were celebrating that loss and damage has been left on the agenda. And we said, this is not reason enough to celebrate. It doesn't matter whether something is on the agenda. What we want is the conclusion. What is the outcome of such agenda item? If you permit, I may read. The agenda item title, as reformulated, reads such: matters relating to funding arrangement, responding to loss and damage associated with adverse effects of climate change, including a focus on addressing loss and damage. The following text will be added as a footnote to the title for the item. The item and the outcomes thereof are without prejudice to the consideration of similar issues in future. To be read out by the President before the adoption, it is understood that the outcomes of this agenda item are based on cooperation and facilitation and do not involve liability and or compensation. The agenda item includes the Glasgow Dialogue. The agenda item will launch a process with a view to adopting a conclusive decision no later than 2024. Now look at this. They are so focused on protecting themselves, I mean the developed countries, from the liability and compensation aspect. They want to be sure that this is in the understanding. What we need is finances for loss and damage that is already happening. What else do we need to prove that loss and damage is already happening? How many millions of people do we need to see? How many millions of corpses do we need to see before we take this seriously as an emergency? These are the frustrations of a continent that has done nothing. Yet, if we keep postponing even the conclusion by 2024, we don't know what the conclusion will hold. Are we not just playing delaying tactics while Africa is burning and flooding at the same time? Can't we just change the language? Now we hear issues of insurance. The ambassador just left. She talked about the premiums that are existing in other parts of the world that are so prohibitively high that even governments cannot address that. For a continent that the population, the majority of the population cannot even afford health insurance, we are diverting the dialogue or the talks to bringing in solutions that are not even accessible, are not even practical, are not even possible for the people on the ground. Tell me what the woman in Malawi that has lost her children and her farms and her livelihood has to do to prove that climate change, that loss and damage is real. Tell me how this farmer or this pastoralist in the Horn of Africa who has lost more than 7,000 animals in the past couple of years, what does he do to prove that loss and damage is already in his doorsteps and that it is within his house? We, from the African civil society, we think there's a lot of hypocrisy, and whosoever pretends that they are comfortable or they are conscious of the parts of loss and damage is only paying a lip service, because we have not seen anything on the ground. We have to be more serious, and humanity has to come together and name and shame these people. It can't continue this way. By 2024, you want to find a solution for corpses? You want to find a solution for a continent that is void of people? This is not fair. This is unjust, and we think we don't look for sympathy. Africa is not looking for sympathy. Africa is just asking to be compensated for what they are losing, they have lost, and they continue to lose. And it is not their fault. We don't intend to take anybody to jail. The fact is that people are losing their livelihoods. People are dying. So relieve them from this pain. Relieve them from this situation. The trauma that it comes with it cannot be measured. So thank you. I think we have to be serious as humanity to address this issue of loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Augustine, for reminding us of the injustice that vulnerable people, and especially on the African continent, have faced in so many years because of climate change and because of the power balances within the walls of these COPs. We're going to go back to the Caribbean with our second speaker, who is none other than Jevanic Henry. Jevanic is a young climate change and development professional with experience leading and supporting the development of environmental projects at the national, regional, and multilateral level. He currently supports the project management and technical delivery of the Commonwealth's Climate Change Program to its 56 member countries, primarily on enhancing access to climate finance, including efforts aimed at integrating gender and youth considerations in climate projects, developed and wider NDC implementation. Jevanic, thanks for being one of the many voices of the youth at this COP. Can you tell us how populations in Caribbean islands currently face repetitive hurricanes and sea level rise, what resources they currently have access to, and what is missing that people at this COP can provide?
Yes, thank you, Inez. And of course, as Dr. Augustine would have mentioned, that getting, of course, loss and damage financing on the agenda was, a good start. But of course, it took a couple of years, or more than a couple of years, and finally we're here in Sham. But let me take you back just briefly to a journey as to what has happened during that time. We've been deliberating on this to the Caribbean. So let's just go across the world. 2010, Hurricane Thomas devastated several islands. St. Lucia, where I come from, 43% of GDP loss. How are we going to recover from that? Remember, 2010 is when economies were just starting to rebuild following the last economic downturn. Then we go to Tropical Storm Erica, which was mentioned previously by Ambassador, Hurricane Maria, which of course led to 224, 226% of GDP loss. And we looked at what happened to Antigua and Barbuda, particularly Barbuda, where the island was essentially, uninhabitable after this disaster. And going further, so we're now in, 2017, but let's go back a bit to 2013, December 24th, Christmas Eve. In our culture, of course, that is a significant event. And out of the hurricane season, we were hit by this devastating Christmas Eve trough, which I think was a significant moment within the region. One, because it was out of season, and the devastating impact which it led to. And I think that sort of led to the momentum, of course, at 2015, to get in towards the Paris Agreement. But why is this significant is that I know we spoke a lot about the economic costs and so on, but there's also the non-economic costs which happens with these disasters. And going beyond that to 2013, flash floods in November 6, 2015 in St. Lucia devastated the half of the island. And interestingly, on our way here to COP, and I think this one is, well, probably one of the most recent, only on Sunday, half of the island, that is the island of St. Lucia, was literally underwater. And of course, the northern part of the island, which is essentially the economic hub. So you begin to understand the consequences which that causes for the economy. Because remember, we're only just recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. And now how are we supposed to rebuild? How are we supposed to rebuild in a manner that will allow us to continue our resilience efforts? And that is one of the challenges which we face. And I've mentioned St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua, and Barbuda. And this problem is essentially, it's the similarities across our islands, and I can go on and on. But of course, in the interest of time, I think we can understand that it is our living reality. We always like to say it's a climate emergency, but literally right now we are on life support. And I don't think we can, hold on for very much longer unless, of course, that we get this much needed, fit for purpose, multilateral fund dedicated towards addressing loss and damage financing. And of course, like the ambassador would have mentioned, there are existing facilities within the region, for example, the CRIF insurance facility. There are existing multilateral organizations which are supporting the countries in the region to access that much needed finance. But of course, what is being pushed, and I think we need to also reiterate that loss and damage financing should not be confused with all of the other adaptation funding and so on. We want essentially a new, additional, and most importantly, fit-for-purpose fund, and I need to reiterate that point, which is readily available because, of course, we cannot go through the long accreditation process or, taking the 6 years or so on that will allow us to access these funds, because within that waiting period, there will be significant other damage to it. So I think it's important that we understand that this is our everyday reality, and I think particularly for our fragile economies, which are extremely dependable on, for example, the tourism sector, and how these disasters, particularly hurricanes and sea level rise, is posing an increasing threat to our economies and the sustainability of our economies. I mean, of course, and I'm speaking all of this before COVID, before the COVID pandemic, so you can imagine the situation we currently face, of course, compounded with our existing high debt levels, our debt to GDP ratios, which in most cases is quite unhealthy. So which is why, of course, you get this call not only from the Caribbean region, but I can say the small island developing states from around the world are pushing for this dedicated funding. And I think we should not stop. But of course, there is, like I said, there is the existing facilities which we can build upon that will allow this much needed loss and damage financing to meet the countries that most need. And like Ambassador Dr. Augustine would have mentioned, that we did it in the Caribbean, we are definitely not responsible for it. And I think everybody in the crowd here, in the audience here today, can agree that we are not responsible for it. But at the same time, what happens, like is happening right now in St. Lucia and right now in Bahamas with the recent storm, is that we now need to go literally beg into the same international community to help us rebuild. But that is why there is a need for this dedicated facility that could allow us to respond and will allow us to post these events to build back better, as was mentioned, and also to help support our climate-smart reconstruction efforts. Once again, I just want to reiterate that for us, it is not only an emergency, we are literally on life support, and we literally need this loss and damage, dedicated loss and damage financing facility. Thank you.
Thank you, Jevanic. And what I take from your intervention is the trap in which Caribbean countries are stuck because of the lack of support to recover in a sustainable way from the repetitive extreme events, hurricanes that hit these islands and that stop them from getting out of poverty and to allow a fair development for all their population, and the need to use the infrastructures that already exist to provide the finance at the local level, at the national level, but the insufficiency that this represents and the fact that we need more funding in this regard. I will now ask Giata Ugwa-Ekele to turn on her microphone. Giata is the Knowledge Management and Extension Assistant to the Climate and Sustainable Development Network, SCDevNet, which is the designated national platform of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance in her country of Nigeria. There she has gained relevant experience in climate and environmental advocacy, program management, website publication, and digital activism. She's also at the same time pursuing a Master of Sustainable Agriculture and Food Security at the Newcastle University under the Commonwealth Scholarship. Giata, my question to you is the following. Could you provide an example of lived experiences of loss and damage in Nigeria? And what I'm especially interested in knowing is what resources the people affected have found and used to recover, and if they have received any external funding at all from private or public structure, where did that money come from, but also what are the threats that they're still facing, and what is the gap in the support that they have received?
Thank you, Ines. My name is Giata Ekele. I am the Knowledge Management and Extension Assistant for Climate and Sustainable Development Network of Nigeria, CISDevNet in short, which is the national platform for the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, PACJA. I'm also doing my MSc in Sustainable Agriculture and Food Security at Newcastle University, UK. I am here basically to share about the lived experiences of loss and damage. You see, beyond climate adaptation and climate mitigation, we're talking about economic and non-economic cost crisis that has been caused by extreme weather events in climate change, like hurricanes, storms, floods, and the likes. And for me, I come from a community that has been badly impacted by floodings in Nigeria, talking about the Middle Belt region of Nigeria, Kogi State in particular. My community has experienced numerous flooding every year that they are now accustomed to these floods. In fact, when these floods happen, they just carry out their normal domestic activities in this dirty water that has also impacted their livelihoods. It has caused lots of waterborne diseases amongst the indigenes in this community. Even the young ladies have been impacted, talking about menstrual hygiene and how that polluted water body is affecting the young ladies in my community. Right now, let me just move to the overall statistics of flooding in Nigeria. According to the federal government of Nigeria statistics on flooding, this year alone, year 2022, Nigeria has witnessed a devastating episode of seasonal floods causing over 603 deaths. More than 2,400 persons have been injured by floods. Over 1.4 million persons have been displaced by floods this year alone. In Nigeria, we have 82,135 houses that have been damaged. These are livelihoods that are lost. We have over 332,000 hectares of land that have been lost, damaged or completely damaged or partially submerged in water. Beside the deaths, beside the injuries, beside the displacement, what about the crops? What about the livestock that are being affected? What about the livelihoods? People can't go to the markets. People can't do anything in the community because of those floods. So let me move back to statistics in the year 2012, that is a decade ago. Nigeria experienced one of its worst floods in 40 years. And the incident affected 32 states. from July to October in that year, 2012, 7 million people were affected. 2 million others were counted as internally displaced persons by floods. Over 5,000 persons were physically injured, and over 5,900 houses were destroyed. From history to this date, floods have been affecting different parts of Nigeria, and Nigeria is not the only country that has been affected by floods in Africa. All of Africa is affected by floods. We're here talking about the Caribbean. Every part of the global south is affected by floods. Mr. Augustine talked about Africa being flooded and also burning at the same time. Flood is on one side, and then we have drought on the other side. So what I'm trying to say is that loss and damage is a life and death issue, and it should be treated like one. It should be treated with urgency. It should be treated with responsibility. It should be treated with dedication. We're talking about finance. We are not begging. We are demanding for what is just. It is just that Africa that did not contribute to this climate change should not be the one suffering for it, and be the money that's supposed to be used for our development will now be used for you know, trying to absorb the shock from this climate change vulnerability. So what I'm trying to say is that loss and damage is a life and death issue, and it should be treated like one, with urgency, with dedication, and with responsibility from the West. Thank you.
Thank you, Giata, for reminding us of the emergency and also the special attention that should be put on women and on their needs and their own specific vulnerabilities. Our last panelist for this first panel is none other than Maite Rodriguez-Blandon. Maite is an organizer and activist from Guatemala with extensive experience in training and policy advocacy on the issues of gender, disaster risk reduction, and resilience. Maite sits on the governing council of the Huairou Commission, having represented women's organization in various international policy-making and advocacy spaces for the last 20 years. Maite is also the founder and director of Fundación Guatemala and is engaged in facilitating national, regional, and global partnerships with grassroots organizations, particularly indigenous women's organizations in Latin America. Maite, could you tell us about how the women within the communities you work with face climate-induced loss and damage? What are the actions taken at the community level to protect the livelihoods of people, grassroots women, in order to prevent a severe loss and damage during the climate events, and also what supporting climate finance looks like for those women?
Okay, so glad to be here, and really after listening to all of you, I think we are in the same page, absolutely. But I think we need to reflect about that loss and damage is now more a conversation among countries, and is not really what we need to address, and we need to switch to the local level, because in that sense, we can invest in the local level to prevent the damage in people's livelihoods. There's no conversation about people's livelihoods, and I think it's important that we can mention some of these loss and damage that are happening and are very invisible in one way. Women's work and incomes in the informal sector, also women's caregiving work. Now, every local government is talking about care system, but care systems are from before, from the indigenous communities and ancestral traditions. The issue is that now, with COVID-19, everyone wants to reflect about care that happened in the world. Then also it's important to talk about the loss of well-being. That includes mental health, the kids being out of and removed from schools, especially girls that needs to move to be workers, and also the young kids are gonna be put at work. But also the loss of indigenous species and the loss of cultural heritage, the displacement of communities and indigenous that now are the climate migrant people in the US, especially from Latin America. we can talk about livelihoods, the loss and damage in our countries, but also we have to talk about really examples of what is happening to protect livelihoods right now. And it's not something that some governments are trying to do at the very local level. We, as the Huairou Commission, are implementing a very innovative mechanism, the Community Resilience Fund, that is operating in Africa, in Asia, and also in Latin America. And this is something that we are working together with the grassroots organizations across the regions, trying to doing the utilization of the resources that we provide to the grassroots organizations to leverage and advocate to the local governments to invest in protecting livelihoods of people. Because if we are not doing this at this level, then everything that you are talking about, the numbers and the data about the loss and damage at the country level is going to be increasing. Absolutely. The thing and the change has to be now. We need to do some kind of processes and work during the time that we are working on talking about loss and damage, but we need to reflect mechanisms that really allows women to empower themselves and to do action adaptation and to develop strategies to avert, to minimize and address loss and damage at the very local level. I think the discussion, I think the dynamic is different in this process. We saw yesterday how the government of Austria is going to invest $50 million in loss and damage. So we need to ask and to check about how and what amount of these funds are going to be really at the local level. Because otherwise it's going to be the same and the repetition of all of this that we are working and talking here. I'm going to provide 3 different examples from each region, one of each region that is operating now and that we are investing this Community Resilience Fund to make difference and to make the change that is happening. Because when we are talking about climate change, we are talking about 2 different areas. Climate, we cannot do anything with the climate. But change, yes, we can, and we need to advocate, and we need to invest in this kind of change of mentalities, of programs, and also from processes. The first example I want to explain, and all of these are related to different climatic threats, no? Hurricanes, tropical storms, cyclones, droughts. And the first one is about the community group at Shibuye in Kenya. They were the first caregivers in Africa dealing with the HIV/AIDS since long ago when we had the first pandemic in the world. Then the care system was there, but was invisible in one way. But now, from the caregivers, they transit to the area of climate, agriculture, and smart agriculture, and they were starting to work on livelihoods with organic agriculture. Right now, they are starting to sell carbon bonus at the country level. In this community, this grassroots organization is doing that, but in a very well-informed operational way, because they are still protecting their livelihoods and not only working for someone else, like selling the carbon bonus. The second example I want to bring is from Asia, is from India, with the Swayam Shiksham Prayogs, where we started. In fact, this organization was teaching Latin America, and we are learning from them how to implement the community resilience approach and how to really implement the empowering women doing community resilience building. They were defining and they were designing the women-led climate resilient farming model that has been an innovation, because in different aspects, they started just utilizing and doing some kind of organic farming with the Shakti program and everything, and then they transformed, especially their livelihoods, because they diversified the farms and the families, and now they are business, they have business, and they are dealing with the private sector using and doing this kind of practice. My third example is going to be related to Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Guatemala and Honduras, for example. With this mechanism of Community Resilience Fund that we are implementing, trying to reduce the loss and damage at the country's levels, because we are investing at the local level, is related to a Garifuna organization, Wawucha, and another one, La Rubeya. Those organizations were implementing the seeds banks and the tools banks. The tools bank was especially designed for the Hurricane Mitch, when it hit Category 5 as well, Honduras. And they were implementing this innovation on resilience practice, and it was awarded with the Equatorial Prize because of the innovation and how they were training local authorities. The same thing is happening now with the demonstration sites of resilience practices. How grassroots women leaders are teaching, are training local governments and the local disaster management agencies to prove that if they implement in small plots of land different resilience practices, they will have different ways to improve livelihoods and different ways to do some kind of, reducing the loss and damage, because they are working in preparation. They are working in preparedness, and they are also working at the very local level. So also the organization, the SSP that we say, the Swayam Shishkam Prayogs from India that I was mentioned before, is now one of the 20 experiences that is going to be awarded with the adaptation award here in the COP. So it means that we really need to change the dynamic, the discussion on loss and damage. We really are convinced that we need to reallocate resources in women's hands at the very grassroots level, in women's organizations or grassroots organizations, because there is a matter of doing a climate justice strategies, really, but also to change the impact of loss and damage at the very country level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maite. I think what we can take out of this panel, as Maite beautifully said, is that local organizations are not waiting for the global organizations to act on loss and damage. They're already doing the work themselves, and each and single panelist for this first panel showed that to us. So I would like to thank them for sharing their experience with us. A round of applause, please. Thank you. Normally, I would have taken one or two questions right now, but we have another panel. So I suggest that, if possible, our panelists stay with us to listen to the second panel, and we'll come back for the Q&A at the end so that you can ask them your questions. And otherwise, one of the reasons we're doing this event is so that they can present themselves to you and you can approach them during the rest of the COP. So thank you so much for joining us, and I would like to invite our second panelists to join the stage. We're welcoming Michai Robertson, Oluwole Oshota, who will be joining us virtually, Zoha Shawoo, Ritu Bharadwaj, and Anne Callaghan. Great. So I'm going to start with Michai, who is extremely busy during this COP and makes us the honor of joining us for this panel. Michai is from Antigua and Barbuda, and he is an advisor to the chair of Alliance of Small Island States, or known here as AOSIS, on climate change, oceans, and legal matters. He is part of the permanent mission of Antigua and Barbuda to the United Nations in New York. So Michai, how do the stories and experiences we've heard from Augustine, Jevanic, Ekele, and Maite inform the positions, demands, and work of AOSIS on finance for loss and damage? And how do you think they can inform the discussions happening at COP27 on the matter?
Thanks a lot, and good afternoon, colleagues. I think, first of all, those interventions were really grounding. And I think one thing that, to answer the specific question, which is on how do they feed back into positions, demand, and the work of the AOSIS, essentially it's our foundation. So it's the foundation of all of those positions, demands. And just to let you understand that the position that we developed as AOSIS, specifically for the fund, that's an operating entity of the financial mechanism, came from at least more recently, from a similar process of us having regional workshops with our climate and especially focal points back home who are implementing the different policies and facing the brunt and the issues that we all have. And so I think it's very crucial and important for us to note that even beyond, for example, those workshops where we ask, simply put, what are the activities that you need funded to address loss and damage? A lot of people don't ask that question, and they don't then have a clear cataloging of all of those issues. And I think that approach helped to inform, and you'll see it in the briefing note that we had as AOSIS, a lot of the different areas that we intend to focus on that stream from non-economic losses, which obviously is where a brunt of the gaps are, but as well as economic losses and enabling activities. And so one thing I do want to highlight, and kind of the common thread between all of the different presentations, was this notion of survival, right? But one thing that we've been trying to push forward is that we don't only have a right to survive, but to thrive. And a lot of countries don't appreciate that in the context of addressing loss and damage, but we had a discussion about, I think it was debt sustainability, all these different areas where we were already in a really bad position, but for if we ever had climate change. And now that we have climate change in the mix, that is a huge issue from beyond our chance to survive, which I think is great, you know, if we survive. But we should really and truly be trying to put us in a better place of where we could have been thriving if not for those inherent injustices. So I do think that we need to bear that in mind while we push forward. I think a next thing in relation to the stories and experiences is that we need to move beyond clever linguistics. So sadly, I'm a negotiator, and it is absolutely frustrating being in a room, and we heard about it on the floor, where we are just constantly battling over who is trying to create the most creative language in order to protect their state interest, and not getting to the heart of it, as many of the different colleagues on the table were discussing, right, and the impacts that they face. And it's disrespectful. It is disrespectful to a lot of their experiences, and we're not paying due justice. And the fact that it took us 30 years to get this discussion and these formally going in a process where it's talking about a global response to climate change, I think it's long overdue. It's one first step, but as our colleague, Dr. Augustine said, it's nothing to congratulate yourself and have a fake mission accomplished banner, right, behind you saying that, you know, you've done your work. We still have a lot more to be done, and we'll still continue to push for making sure that we have a clear understanding of what we need, as well as the modalities that we need to channel those funding through to get effective access on the ground, which leads me to a really good point, I think, that many also made, which is about local and regional level responses. You know, we talk about direct access, enhanced direct access, and weirdly enough, when we were trying to put forward our proposal as AOSIS and design it, we put the word enhanced direct access in the proposal, but then we were like, but that has a connotation of not even being enhanced direct access. So we were trying to play on words. Is it actualized enhanced direct access? So this is where we are right now, is that we're trying to reinvent something that, at least from my understanding, one clear example that I think actually does work is, for example, what the Jeff created in 1991 with its small grants program, right? That gets down to the ground, even though it's a small amount, but it does get down to the ground to a community level where I know, for example, many community groups in Antigua have access to Jeff small grants program, right? And they didn't need to go through toxic accreditation processes to get that money. However, the issue with that money is that it's not enough, and that is not focused on, for example, addressing loss and damage. And so using those modalities and trying not to reinvent the wheel and looking at a lot of the history that we've had in relation to creating other facilities and other funds, it's quite important because the answer might just be right in front of us, and we just need to figure out a way to replicate it on that scale. I think there's 3 more points that I want to make. Many other things that we can discuss. But one thing I heard on the floor was a focus on non-economic losses. Our colleagues are talking about the loss of a child, the loss of her livelihood, cultural heritage, education. I challenge any one of you, and I've done the stats, if you look at the accredited entities of the Green Climate Fund, of the Global Environmental Facility, of the Adaptation Fund, there's only one of those funds that has an accredited entity that can deal with the 3-4 sort of main areas of non-economic loss. So that being health, education, cultural heritage. I'm trying to forget the last one. But the only accredited entity that we have to the Adaptation Fund, so there's none for the GEF and none for the GCF, is UNESCO in relation to the Adaptation Fund. So these funds themselves are not positioned in a way and have the partners included in their broader partnership even to look at non-economic losses. So it kind of brings me to the last point I'll make, so just put that, and maybe I'll just end with that point, is be careful of loss and damage washing. I don't know what to call it, but it's the greenwashing that we're seeing right now at this COP, with all of these different pledges made by big countries that are trying to again use clever linguistics to have a media moment, again, off of the backs of those who need to be actually seeing results on the ground, essentially. And so we do have to make sure that we get ahead of these pledges, and I think that's why this process that we're trying to create under this agenda item is to make sure that we give clear guidance to those bilateral initiatives so that they're focusing squarely on addressing and noting that the money is for that, and also it's new and additional, because from my understanding, about 2 out of the 4 main pledges I've seen so far is actually just repackaging and relabeling money that they've already committed to. So I think we do need to have a sense of responsibility, and those contributors, we'd rather have something that is actually new and additional rather than saying you're giving us this loss of damage funding, again, mission accomplished banner. So I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michai. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is there virtually. Can I ask the technical experts in the back of the room to share Oluwole Oshota with us? Great. Oluwole, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Great. We can hear you perfectly. So let me introduce you quickly. Oluwole is the president of International Youth and Student Movement for the United Nations and has over 10 years of international NGO leadership and advocacy experience. Oluwole, my question to you is very simple. How do the previous stories shared inform your work, and what do you think is the role of youth movements in obtaining finance for loss and damage at this COP?
Well, thank you for the good question. If for no other things, the particular way it has been has to do with the fact that it asks for, want to be more strategic. And I say this for you to appreciate what I mean by that, let me just take us a little bit back, along the memory lane. We have seen, we have heard from, what has been talked about. We don't particularly even need, to look on the pictures or TV or, reportage or, to be told what is happening in the global south. Even some of us living in the north here, we can see, like here in the US, you see what happened recently in Florida. And needless to say, in our professional area, for example, in my own career, architecture, typically we ask for, some seasoned wood, to be used in particular area. Is non-available in the quantity as it used to be because of the, very easy reason, supply chain problems. So people in the north already are aware or should not claim not to be aware of climate changing and the possible impact in the south. So here is the thing: is that it's just that the our diplomat just have to keep, being resolute on what strategically are important, and that is a committed facility for loss and damage. And from my particular work in the past, I mean, we have gone through similar experiences, when we have issues like, conscientious objectors. ISMUN happens to be one of the first, organization to be a signatory to that. And when the HIV issue was so, very, very rampant, we happens to be one of the few that advocated for it to be recognized as one of the emerging issues, going through the Millennium Global Conference then. And in most recent time to having realized that intergenerational dialogue needs to be infused. Myself and my colleague, we do come to, the COP in 2009, to be precise, in Copenhagen, with the being one of the very few organizations, to talk about the issue of intergenerational equity. And the rest assured, young people are very smart, they catch up on that. I've seen them even up to today, still, making it as an issue to get what they need. And it is on that line, that I would like to talk about what we are doing presently, by next year, we will be organizing our third International Youth Leadership Training on South-South Cooperation. The essence of that is because it's always difficult to get people from Global South together, and to, it become important to get them properly trained on issues, important issues like loss and damages, and that is what we are going to do in Barbados. As soon as the government sign the document, we should be there next year to do that, and that will be the third one. And mind you, the first one was held in Nigeria also. So, and then the other project that we have has to do with the Youth for Environment Global Teaching Project, where we, intend, which is going to be more of global, interaction and teaching.
Oluwole,
And yes.
can I ask you to wrap up in 1 minute so we make sure that all our panelists have the time to speak, please?
All right, thank you. So to finalize, and from the movement, what we intend to do is to ensure that, we stay engaged, as NGO working together on loss and damages, and, essentially public policy outreach program also is very important to us. And we intend to, make sure, fundraising are done at the local level, through programs like ISMUN Volunteer Corps program, because essentially we cannot wait for multilateral process to yield. People are dying and things need to be done. And the way to do it is by getting hands at the local level engaged. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oluwole, and I'm very sorry that I had to cut you off. Our next speaker is my colleague from SCI, Shawoo, who is an associate scientist in the Equitable Transition Program at the Stockholm Environment Institute's US Center. Her research primarily focuses on the intersection between climate change, inequality, and sustainable development, and she's co-leading SCI's research on operationalizing finance for loss and damage. Zoha? Based on SCI's work and on the stories you've just heard, what does fair, feasible, and effective loss and damage finance mean, and what does it look like concretely? And I'll ask you to be brief.
Thank you. I think a lot of the stories that we've heard today reinforce what we've said through our research, which is that any solution for loss and damage finance, whatever is decided at this COP about loss and damage finance, needs to center the priorities of vulnerable communities, and particularly marginalized communities such as women, indigenous groups, ethnic and racial minorities. They need to be able to access finance, and anything that is designed should be in accordance with their own needs and priorities. So what does that actually mean in terms of the specific modalities of financing? For example, we suggest that we need to prioritize grant-based financing, not loans that would increase debt. We need to prioritize programmatic financing, not project-based financing that requires long lag times in accreditation and access and proposal development years before money is actually mobilized. We need to prioritize small grants and unconditional cash transfers. The UNDP Small Grants Program was mentioned because that gives directly devolved decision-making power to the actual communities that need to access the finance, and makes sure that they have autonomy to utilize the money in accordance with their own needs, and can also, bypass government structures that often do not make sure that finance reaches those who need it the most. We need to ensure enhanced direct access mechanisms, which kind of, again, devolve decision-making power to the local level and better ensures recipient ownership in how finance is utilized. So that could include, for example, coalitions of grassroots organizations working together to be able to access funds and making sure that those are prioritized. Decision-making, we need to ensure that vulnerable and marginalized communities are involved at decision-making at all levels of how finance is utilized, including at the global level by sitting on the boards of a potential loss and damage finance facility or a fund. And finally, we need participatory monitoring and evaluation approaches. So making sure that we are being accountable not only to funders, but also to local communities themselves, and working with them to make sure that finance can be utilized in accordance with their needs. So all of this was in our report on operationalizing finance for loss and damage, which details the structures and modalities of a potential loss and damage finance facility. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoha. For having worked on that research, it's the most efficient and short summary of it that I've ever seen. Our next speaker is Ritu Bharadwaj. Ritu is the team leader and principal researcher in climate governance of risk and finance in the climate change group of the International Institute of Environment and Development, also known as IIED. She has more than 20 years of senior policy development experience, research management experience in government, funding agencies, and international NGOs, and has worked extensively on climate resilience, resource conservation and social protection, migration, and gender issues. Ritu, IIED has conducted a series of deliberative dialogues with the actors from the Global South. You're going to tell us about it, I believe. What are the practical approaches to delivering finance for tracking loss and damage that has emerged from these deliberations?
Thank you, Inez, and I'll certainly not be as brief and succinct as Zoha. See, we heard the panelists in the previous session, and what clearly emerged was with the growing intensity and frequency, the communities and countries in the Global South are seeking finance and technical assistance, not just for anticipating and managing the impacts that they're expected to face in future, but also those that they are facing currently. And I'm not even talking about climate finance. The kind of finance that is currently available to the countries and communities, they are in no way effective or sufficient to meet the dynamic, multidimensional nature of risk, which are both compounding and consecutive in nature. And they are not appropriate in dealing with the ways in which many of these, the diverse ways in which these risks manifest themselves and in different time frames. So, and also the way the intensity of these impacts are increasing, they're insufficient. The volume of the finances that are available are insufficient. And I'm not going to repeat what was already said about the GCF. GCF probably is the only named climate finance available, but there is an accreditation process. There's a proposal-based approach to accessing it, which typically takes a very long time. One of the assessments says it takes about 5.5 years for a country which is not accredited to access that finance. You can clearly understand what impact it would have already created till the time a country submits a proposal to the time it receives it. The problem is these funding sources, they are governed by the fund mandate rather than by the mandate or the priorities or the needs of communities. Then again, many of these funds are sectoral in nature. So they're either focusing on humanitarian assistance, DRR, and others. And although they do support communities in some way, but they're only dealing with part of the problem. They're not looking at it from a comprehensive or a holistic approach to dealing with it. So in our deliberative dialogue, where we not just involved the people who are dealing with climate issues, but also those who are at the cutting edge, those who are dealing with this at the front line. And thankfully, Michai was part of those discussion. And what they really suggested was more practical ways in which we can use the current sources of finances available, because clearly the panelists in the previous session, they said they are facing the issues, these impacts now, so they need the solution now. So what can we do for that? So one of the solutions that emerged was we need to harmonize the governance of existing sources of finance, where the typical approach should be one cross-government and a cross-society facility at the national level, where I'm just going to talk about the five-pronged approach that came out of that discussion. Firstly, they said that the planning for prioritizing where these funds should be used should be bottom-up, should be decided by the community, because even within the community, different groups, these risks manifest differently for each of them. So this planning process has to be really bottom-up and should be agnostic of any funding priorities, because we don't want these planning process to be influenced, we are focused on humanitarian response, can you make the planning process according to that? So, and we use the existing government process, a decentralized approach for developing these plans, combine them at subnational level and then at the national level. The second approach to that was to harmonize the governance of these existing sources of finance, which could include the existing humanitarian fund, ODA fund, bilateral funds, the DRR fund, in a way, and including the insurance fund, in a way that we are able to package them differently to meet the different needs of these plans that have emerged bottom-up. Thirdly, support them with a suite of agile local institutions, which of course, we can't develop them overnight, but we are hoping that these local institutions, the CBOs, the technology suppliers, the service providers, they will learn and they will grow their capacities over time through collaborative working. Fourthly, we are saying, as been pointed out, that the planning process cannot be fixed. The traditional approach has been to get a proposal, get it sanctioned, and there it is. Your 5-year mandate is fixed. You can't change it in that period. This planning process or this implementation or delivery process has to be more agile and suited to adaptive programming and to the rapidly changing context that we're seeing within the loss and damage space. And that can only be done if we are responsive, if there is a constant, a proper feedback loop, which allows these planning process, this response mechanism to change depending on the needs as they emerge locally.
Ritu, can I ask you to finish up?
And I'm just going to make the final point. The final point is we need to develop these national facilities more as a marketplace, which can enable connecting the experience, expertise, and peer-to-peer learning. And the whole idea behind developing these national facilities is to make sure that it provides a practical way in which we receive and devolve finance in a way that is locally led, locally appropriate, and is relevant to the dynamic and changing needs of the communities and the countries. And in view of the climate justice parameter, we want the countries to be on the driving seat as to how they want to use this fund and not be given out dole that this is your climate finance and please use it the way we want you to use it.
Thank you. And finally, we're going to hear from Callaghan, who is Policy Officer at the Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund and the co-chair of the international group of the Stop Climate Chaos Scotland Coalition. She has 28 years of experience of working in public campaigns advocacy on a range of issues on climate justice, human rights, children's rights, trade justice, economic and social cultural rights, as well as social justice issues in the UK. Anne, can you tell us about costs and ways of raising funding for loss and damage from the global north, since many governments may not think that it is the right time to raise additional funds for climate action? What is your message to them?
Well, our message is, if not now, when. So we published this report sort of about a month or so ago, Financing Climate Justice, Fiscal Measures for Climate Action in a Time of Crisis. And if we don't actually start raising money to address climate change and also address climate justice, then we're kind of dooming ourselves entirely. So this report looks at basically 3 levels in which we can actually raise the funds. As many as you know, sort of last year, Scotland kind of broke the deadlock on loss and damage by giving the kind of first money from a developed country to that. But the First Minister herself acknowledged that this was something more in the kind of token level. It was a symbolic level, but she did frame it as a kind of almost the start of reparations, a debt we owe. But we want to move beyond kind of symbolic amounts coming forward. And this report might be, and there may be other reports out there that we'd like to kind of see, but what we wanted to do was try and kind of inspire others to kind of explore at their kind of national, regional, and kind of local perspectives how we can start raising some significant sort of amounts of kind of finance. So in a UK context, this report looks at what the UK government can do, what the Scottish government can do because it has some additional powers, and what can happen at a local authority level. And the report initially had about 130 different ways to sort of raise money, and we kind of boiled those down using a number of different kind of principles. So one was, would it help change behavior in terms of driving down sort of emissions? That's something that's kind of very vital in the kind of make polluters pay sort of kind of approach to things. Would it help raise money? Would we be able to kind of do it at speed? And would we be able to embed a sort of an equity principle also sort of at home? As I mentioned, Scotland is kind of still part of the UK, so a lot of our kind of ODA spend is kind of overseas development spend is contained within what the kind of UK government sort of does. But if we were to adopt a fair shares approach, combining both loss and damage kind of responsibility and our sort of the amount that we should give to kind of make that 100 billion go, we'd be looking somewhere in the region of 1.4% of Scotland's GDP, which would work out to about 2.3 billion. So then the report then kind of boils down, well, what are some of the sort of the taxes that could be sort of looked at? So obviously one of the big ones at UK government level is actually an effective sort of levy on fossil fuel companies. So at the moment, the UK government gives somewhere in the region of over 13.6 billion towards fossil fuel companies. the sort of levy that the previous kind of Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, or now PM, sort of imposed upon fossil fuels was meant to raise somewhere in the region of 5 billion, but then at the same time as these tax breaks, where 91p in every pound is kind of clawed back by the fossil fuel companies. So we need genuine, actual levies on fossil fuel companies, and that's something that we've all heard. At a Scotland level, we have sort of air passenger duty. It's estimated in the UK, because so few people actually do frequent flyer sort of approaches, you could raise somewhere in the region of 5 billion sort of for that. And then in a kind of Scottish context, we also could look at our own taxation system by actually taxing sort of those wealthier in kind of Scottish society. That could raise somewhere between 1 to 2 sort of billion as well. We're also going to explore potentially a sovereign wealth tax, something in the kind of region of what kind of Norway does. Again, that could raise kind of significant sort of amounts of money. So I think our sort of call is it would be great to share what others are doing in terms of actually identifying where additional sources of finance could be. Specifically to Scotland, we're calling on the First Minister to pull together a short life working commission to actually explore this and model what could be sort of given, and because we need to kind of move beyond the kind of symbolic place. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. And yeah, to close the session, I would say that all these experiences show that civil society, whether in the global south or in the global north, know what is needed for us to live in a prosperous and a thriving world in which we are protected from climate change, in which we can avert, minimize, and address climate change. And the COP, the negotiations, cannot happen in a vacuum, and they cannot happen without taking into account the realities that are happening on the ground. Otherwise, it will be irrelevant and harmful. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I know we have taken 5 minutes from the next session, and I apologize for that, so we'll have to skip the Q&A. But I warmly invite you to talk to our panelists from the first and second panel. They will be there for the next days at the COP. Thank you so much for joining, and have a good day.